this is chapter 14, lecture number 2. We're going to look at cerebral spinal fluid, flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, the ventricles of the brain, and the meninges of the brain. So the first thing we're going to look at are the ventricles. So what are ventricles? They're kind of spaces in the brain that contain and make cerebral spinal fluid. We have 3 big ventricles that we'll talk about. The first one is called the lateral ventricle, and that's these big ventricles up here. We have then our third ventricles, which are found right below the lateral ventricles. And then finally, our last ventricle is the fourth ventricle here. If we look at flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, and these ventricles are areas that contain kind of little reservoirs of cerebral spinal fluid, they would flow from lateral ventricles, and they flow through a structure called the interventricular foramen. So there's a little hole right here that allows cerebral spinal fluid to go from the lateral ventricles down here into the third ventricles. So this would be my third ventricle, which would contain cerebral spinal fluid. From the third ventricle, cerebral spinal fluid can flow down this little path right here called the cerebral aqueduct into this last ventricle, which is called the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, part of it will go down into the central canal of the spinal cord. We're going to see in a picture coming up here that there's also an area called apertures. So they're kind of little channel gates that allow cerebral spinal fluid to flow to the right and the left, lateral and median apertures, and it allows that cerebral spinal fluid to flow up around the brain. And we're going to look at that here in just a second. So here's looking at an anterior view. These would be our lateral ventricles. You can see the right and the left hemispheres of our cerebrum. So those lateral ventricles are up in the cerebrum. This would be our third ventricle, which is more in that diencephalon area, so thalamus, hypothalamus area. It would flow down through the cerebral aqueducts. These are our interventricular foramen here. It'll flow down through the cerebral aqueducts into the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is a little space between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So here's that picture. Here's our cerebellum, and it is a gap right in this area. Here's a sagittal view, and this was our corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is an important structure because it's actually called a commissural fiber. And this is one of the areas where fiber or tracts of neural tissue connect to the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So that's this corpus callosum right here. This is my lateral ventricle. It would contain cerebral spinal fluid. This would be my interventricular foramen. So cerebral spinal fluid could flow right through here, this interventricular foramen. This is my third ventricle, and this would be the thalamus. So this is that diencephalon area, thalamus, hypothalamus. This is third ventricle. It can then flow down here through the cerebral aqueduct into this fourth ventricle, which is at the anterior portion of the cerebellum, kind of between the pons and the cerebellum. At this point, it would flow down. You can see a little aperture here, and it would also enter the central canal of the spinal cord. And here's a nice picture again. Here's our corpus callosum, lateral ventricle, third ventricle. This would be our interventricular foramen, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and here's our aperture. So at this point, we would see cerebral spinal fluid flow up around the brain this way. We can see it go down the central canal. We can also see it flow around the spinal cord and go around the brain this way. Your cerebral spinal fluid flows through your subarachnoid space, which we're going to talk about with the meninges. This red tissue right here is called the choroid plexus. Your choroid plexus is where you have specialty cells that actually make your cerebral spinal fluid. And those special cells are called ependymal cells. So here's one choroid plexus, here's a big choroid plexus, here's a choroid plexus. So we'd have ependymal cells that would be secreting cerebral spinal fluid. you make a fair amount of cerebral spinal fluid, and if we never returned it to general circulation, we would basically get water on the brain, because our brain doesn't let everything and anything cross back and forth. We have something called a blood-brain barrier. So cerebral spinal fluid, when it flows up here, this is called the sagittal sinus, and at these little areas, subarachnoid granulations, we allow cerebral spinal fluid to jump back into the venous system of the body. So you can see this big vein right here in the sagittal sinus that allows cerebral spinal fluid to leave the brain. This keeps us from getting too much fluid on our brain. This picture is a zoom in of our choroid plexus. So just to put it in perspective, here's an example of a choroid plexus right here. And if we zoomed in, this would be cerebral spinal fluid. And then this would be a portion where our blood-brain barrier allows things to cross into the brain. Our cells down here, we have specialty cells called astrocytes, which help to keep things from coming in and out that aren't supposed to. Our gases, oxygen and CO2, can easily diffuse across cell membranes. But we also see our epidermal cells here, which are secreting our cerebral spinal fluid. So here would be our blood flow. We could selectively decide what comes in and what comes out at this choroid plexus. And you can see we have some increased surface area here at the choroid plexus. So we can bring things into the brain or remove things. So this would be the brain. We can bring things in to the cerebral spinal fluid, which has about the same composition as a blood plasma, or we can put waste back into the circulation that's leaving the brain. But you can see our cerebral spinal fluid, which is kind of the brain's own circulatory fluid. When we talked about removing cerebral spinal fluid, one thing that we're going to look at are these little bumps right here. These are in the sagittal sinus, and this is where we can let cerebral spinal fluid leave the brain and go to general circulation. So here's a zoom in of one of those little bumps, and cerebral spinal fluid will flow along this space. This is called the subarachnoid space, and it'll flow up, and at this point it can exit the brain into the superior sagittal sinus, and it can enter venous blood flow. There are 3 layers to the brain. These are called meninges, and I'm going to talk about the 3 meninges to the brain. The most outer layer of the brain is called the dura mater. It is the thickest, heaviest layer of the brain. It is the layer that goes in and anchors to the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. So here's our bone, our cranial bones up here. This layer right here is called the periosteal layer of the dura mater, and then this would be the inner layer of the dura mater. This is called the meningeal layer on our dura mater. So that inner part is the meningeal layer, and this would be where our sagittal sinus is. This is called the arachnoid granulation, and it's through the arachnoid layer. Our arachnoid layer is our second layer. So here's our dural layer with our periosteal layer, our meningeal layer, and then the second layer is our arachnoid layer. I always remember the arachnoid layer because it has all these little fibrous legs, kind of like a spider, which helps me remember it. This subarachnoid space is where our cerebral spinal fluid is flowing. So here's our cerebral spinal fluid. It can flow up through these arachnoid granulations, which are basically villi, and then it can jump into the superior sagittal sinus where we have our blood flow between our dura mater, our periosteal layer, and our meningeal layer of our dura mater. The next layer, which covers the brain itself is this pia mater, and it's a super shiny layer right here. So those are our three cranial meninges. They're basically layers or coatings to the brain. Dura mater is the outermost closest to the bone. It has two layers, periosteal, and then again this meningeal layer. Then we have our subarachnoid or our arachnoid layer, which has the subarachnoid space for the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid. And then finally this inner layer is our pia mater. So those are the three layers or coatings to the brain, and you should know the flow of your cerebral spinal fluid, where it is located, where it's made, and where it flows. So it goes from lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle, through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and then it can go around the lateral apertures in that subarachnoid space. It can also go down around the spinal cord. It can enter general circulation here at the dura mater, at those arachnoid granulations. And here's a zoom out. So here we come lateral interventricular foramen, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. Here would be my central canal. I have lateral and median apertures. Here would be a lateral aperture. Here would be a median aperture, which allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow through this subarachnoid space. Up here at the top in the sagittal sinus, it can go through those arachnoid granulations into the superior sagittal sinus, which has our venous blood supply. So that's how cerebral spinal fluid can leave the brain.